back to the Christianity and Business Podcast, an initiative of the Archie W. Dunham College of Business at Houston Baptist University. I'm your host, Darren Shearer, and this is a show that helps Christian business leaders to integrate biblical values into business. You can get more information about HBU's Center for Christianity and Business and sign up to receive free access to all 5 issues of the Christian Business Review Journal by visiting our website at christianityandbusiness.com. Today we'll be discussing the topic of what the Bible says about economics, and we're joined by Jekabs Bikis. Jekabs is Business Administration Department Chair and Associate Professor at LCC International University in Klaipėda, Lithuania. So it is early in the morning here in the U.S., and I believe Jekabs is finishing up for the day there in the late afternoon, all the way in Lithuania. So just amazing how this, what this technology affords us the ability to do. And so LCC, it was formerly known as Lithuania Christian College. So this is a school that really has a Christ-centered biblical worldview at its core and at its founding. He has a PhD in public policy and political economy from the University of Texas at Dallas. And so he did spend some time here in actually 18 years in Texas. He has an MDiv in theology from Baylor University, an MBA in international business, and also a BBA in finance from Dallas Baptist University. He has a wealth of experience that we're going to benefit from here today. Among his areas of study and expertise, he's a global expert in the subject of preconditions for economic growth, teaching business principles to a post-Soviet audience, and also on the positive role of business and human flourishing. Welcome to the Christianity and Business Podcast, Jekabs.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you for that overly generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed the ministry that you and Houston Baptist does, especially through these podcasts that I've gotten to know.
Well, we're really excited to bring more of these international perspectives on the show. And we joked earlier about how I've got a lawnmower running outside of where I am, and Jekabs said if you're hearing a noise on his end, it's probably a snowblower. So we have some climate differences, but certainly we have our common ground in Jesus Christ, and we're looking forward to hearing your perspective. And one of the reasons Jekabs has such an interesting perspective on economics in particular is because he's lived within 3 of the world's major economic systems: capitalism, communism, and a mixed economy. So Jekabs, go ahead and tell us a bit more about your background and how that shaped your economic perspective.
Sure. I was born in communism, as you alluded to here a second ago. I was born in the Soviet Union, in the Republic of Latvia, although it was relatively close to the end of the Soviet Union. I was born about 13 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. But living my school years, my early school years and middle school years in the Soviet system definitely impacted my perspective on the career field that I would subsequently choose in economics. So it certainly was a system that did not encourage very much work effort, I would say. The Soviet system can be summarized maybe by saying that to all according to their needs and from all according to their abilities. That's how it should work in principle. So people didn't have as much choice in their in how their career would be shaped as people in the Western world are familiar with. The monetary rewards, the incentives weren't quite there. Looking up salaries there in the Soviet Union, you can see that the average doctor's salary was maybe about 130 rubles per month, which was actually slightly less than a full-time bus driver's salary. So people didn't quite have the same incentives to develop, to use their talents as they do in the Western world. And so growing up in the Soviet system, I saw the effects, although I didn't really know that at the time. I saw the effects of a system that doesn't have private property, that doesn't really have the same kind of incentives to work effort that we are used to in the West, and that's what I took for granted. So how did that work out? It worked out in a way that many people did not invest themselves quite as seriously in their careers. They might have talents or abilities in, for example, in medicine or in law or in engineering, but they might not see it worth their while to invest extra years of schooling for that when they could have a more blue-collar job that pays the same, or in some cases even more. And so, as a result, the economy suffered. I also grew up in the very much the Soviet-type housing. Which fascinates me as somebody who thinks about political economy, probably more so than other people. But the Soviet housing, imagine the standard Soviet square apartment blocks that perhaps you might have seen on travels through Eastern Europe, or something that people tend to associate with Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. Apartment blocks that are owned by the state. That are built by the state, owned by the state, given to people at very low rates, so people can occupy them for a very small fraction of their income, but nobody really owns them. And so any kind of common spaces, common areas in the housing, but also in the city at large, were very much run down. The maintenance was lacking. The roofs would not be good. The common stairwell areas would not be taken care of. So I got to see, from a childhood perspective, how the society around me operated in the Soviet system, in the Soviet communist system.
I'm curious, Jekabs. I'm assuming you attended a church there in Latvia growing up. How did the church leaders in your church approach the subject of economics? I mean, were there certain scripture passages that they would use to prop up this communist economic philosophy?
I would say that I was certainly blessed to grow up within a Baptist church, and Baptist church in the Soviet Union was very much subversive to the system. It wasn't really seeking to prop up the system. It was definitely declaring the system as evil for many reasons. And so the way that perhaps the church preached or cited scripture with regard to economics was something that's very much not materialistic. So as Christians, we knew that, my parents certainly knew, and their parents did, that their economic prospects are very, very limited. So they were not in church, they were not seeking God so that He would bless them with material things, if that makes sense. They were there for deep reasons of faith. And so many of the Christians in the Protestant churches in the Soviet Union would attend church, but it would be very, very different church, I would say, than what I've experienced when I was living in Texas. It was not at all tied to any kind of economic outcomes or economic prosperity. So scripture verses like Matthew 6, where we hear that we should seek first other things, that we should not be concerned about material goods. Those would be probably much more common verses having to do with reliance on God, on reliance on Him, on not storing up for ourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy it, or where thieves break in and steal, from Matthew 6:19. So those would be the kind of verses that I heard. And speaking of church, it may be interesting that my earliest memories from church were from my Baptist congregation meeting across the city in a different Baptist church's building on Sunday nights instead of Sunday mornings. And the reason was that the Soviet Union had actually taken away or expropriated my congregation's building and made it into a TV studio back in 1950s. So there was an old established Baptist church where my parents eventually attended, and the Soviet Union saw it fit that church building would be expropriated and made into a TV studio to shoot propaganda films. So they chopped off the steeple, closed the windows, and so the congregation itself was allowed to keep meeting, but they had to meet in a neighboring Baptist church's buildings. And that was a common experience for many Christians there.
Wow. And so they did that because they didn't like that your pastor wasn't promoting communism and, as you said, was really subversive to what they were trying to do?
Absolutely, absolutely. In the Soviet system, people had to only serve the state. Any other goal, any other purpose was not really tolerated, especially early in the Soviet system, when my country, Latvia, was first occupied by the Soviet Union in early 1940, and when Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union. Being a Christian was really quite dangerous. People were sent to labor camps in far east in Siberia, just if they dared to serve something other than the state. And so many churches lost their buildings because of that as well.
So it seems safe to say that if it wasn't for your church, your economic worldview and the path that you've been on all these years would be very different.
Absolutely. Christ has impacted my life in every single dimension. Living in the Soviet Union, I was 13 when the Soviet Union came apart. This was in 1991. I had been 11 when I gave my life to Christ. And so after becoming a Christian at age 11, very young age 11, I started seeing these different opportunities in the thaw of the Soviet Union to learn English, to translate in different youth events in my church. And so through that, I got to sense a different perspective on life. And I got to know people from Texas, as well as from England, from some other parts of the United States. So from various Western countries who would come in primarily to speak about God, to evangelize, but also I could see a little bit of their backgrounds. I got to know them. Some of them were business people. Some of them were serving as bivocational ministers, perhaps, who were simply traveling to preach to this new, still dangerous area of post-Soviet Europe. But I got to see what drives them, perhaps what motivates them, how they see their lives as service to God through their particular talents. And yes, that impacted me more so than anything. And eventually that led me to come over from the transition economy of post-Soviet Latvia to come to Texas for 18 years and then to study there and to see how a more or less democratic capitalism economy works.
Wow. Well, anyone who has this idea that the church should just stay out of politics or stay out of business or stay out of economics, I mean, to hear your story and the positive impact that was made by your church on the way that you approach the marketplace, which is where 85% of the Christian workforce spends the majority of their waking hours, here is a testament of how critical it is for our Christian leaders to step up and disciple people in these areas, not just regarding our private life matters like our thought life and our marriages and our devotional life, all these things that are so vitally important, but also in the way that we approach the public sphere as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think as someone who spends my days working at a Christian business school, I always think about how it is that my business students, once they graduate, how they will go out and how they will impact the world for Christ through accounting, through marketing, through management, and through their churches, through what they do on Wednesdays or Sundays or hopefully throughout the whole week, the kind of service that they provide through their churches. So I couldn't agree more that we have to be the salt of the earth. We as Christians have to find ways to be involved and to shape our communities, our society, the best that we know how.
And then you transition into an experience with capitalism. And obviously you got that economic philosophy embedded into you growing up, even in Latvia through your church. But at what point did you first come in contact with capitalism as the economic system for an entire society? And what has been your experience with capitalism?
Yes, so I came to Texas in 1995. And I have to say that one of my, on the very first day in Texas, I noticed how many lights there were. I arrived at night. It was sometime in July, but it was already dark. It was a late flight. And so as my hosts were taking me from the airport to their home, I noticed how many lights there were, how bright the dealerships were, how light the downtown Dallas lights were. And that was a sort of maybe assault on the senses, I might say, of the capitalism, but it differed so much from what I had just left. there is something about capitalism and the kind of maybe materialism that it creates in both the bad way and good way, and that perhaps we can get into it a little bit while later. But that was my first interaction with it. But yeah, I arrived in 1995 and had a true chance to compare the two systems, living there for 18 years. In some of my first classes in economics that I teach now, and at the beginning of semester, a lot of times I'll show to the students the photo of Earth from the space at night, where we can see the illuminated cities in various parts of the globe. And a lot of times we'll spend some time talking about about South Korea and North Korea, about the Korean Peninsula, and seeing the tremendous difference in light that exists on a peninsula. Perhaps you and listeners have seen the picture, but it gives us a great chance to talk about, on one hand, the materialism that is a temptation in capitalism, but also the good that it does. Because when we talk about the lights that illuminate these cities, and we talk about what is behind those lights, well, some of them may be street lights and so on, but some of them may be schools where a young person is learning how to read, maybe a hospital where a premature baby is kept alive by some machine. So in places where the development has taken hold, we can see these lights, right? We can see these lights as evidence of man's activity, of man's maybe stewardship of resources in a particular way. And that was certainly what I saw when I first came to Texas. But I came and I spent 18 years there. I got to observe a system that was built more or less on free, on certain sense of economic freedom. I noticed that people are more free. They're more responsible for their decisions. They take ownership for their career choices. In some cases, they developed better habits, maybe, although not in all cases. I was really surprised by something. I was quite surprised that many people with whom I spoke as a student, when I talked to them about their life ambitions, they would put it in very simple material terms. What we call the American dream. My goal is to have a house by age X and to have 2 cars by age Y and maybe have a particular income by age Z. So that was not, I didn't expect that could be a dream for a person. I didn't know that one could talk in those ways when I left the Soviet Union and then the transition economy of Latvia. And that was very normal for many of my peers in Texas to talk about very material goals, to talk about this American dream. And so then I got to think later, especially when I studied theology and political economy, I got to think about whether that's desirable for society or undesirable, and really seeing both sides of it.
Jekabs, as you approach each of these economic systems, capitalism, communism, through the lens of Scripture, how do you evaluate them?
I think that I personally, growing up in the Soviet Union, I really came to value the idea of freedom. That God created us with a free will, with a free choice. Right off the bat in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, we see that Adam and Eve could choose, right? And they make the wrong choice, and yet God didn't preclude them from choosing. So I think that a good economic system has to start out with the right kind of anthropology. It has to understand that as human beings, we value freedom. I think part of Imago Dei, or the image of God, the image in which God created us, has to do with this fact that we can choose, right? He gave us free will. But then that we fell. So we also have to, I think, understand in any kind of economic system that we're dealing with fallen human beings, that we're dealing with people who make choices, and yet who a lot of times make mistakes in their choices. And so we have to create a system which acknowledges that, and one which maybe even harnesses that. From an economic perspective, I think the goal of economics, the study of economics is simply a study of how people work together to transform goods and resources to satisfy their wants, right? They transform resources into goods and services to satisfy their wants. And then we can think of good ways to do that and bad ways to do that. We can think of ways that create abundance of goods and services so that people's needs and perhaps wants are satisfied, versus systems that don't do that. We can also categorize systems which produce this abundance while taking care of the environment, the nature, and other systems perhaps that don't do that. So those are the sort of ways that I think about economics, and then I look at what we as Christians should strive for and should do. And as a Christian economist, I try to think where these two ideas come together. Right, so in Christianity, I think that we're called to do multiple things, to have no idols, for example, right? One of the commandments, Exodus 23, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So in a system which creates a lot of prosperity, like the capitalist system, with all of its benefits, we have to be very careful that we don't create idols for ourselves, that we don't start idealizing that first house and that second and third car and so forth. We have to know where to draw the lines, and we have to also recognize that we will always be tempted in that direction. Right, so that's one of the dimensions I think of a Christian economics, is that I like the system that creates abundance for people because it takes care of needs that people have. Right, we were called to take care of the orphan and the widow, the least of these, and capitalist system does that much more than any other system. And at the same time, we have to moderate this abundance, this presence of material well-being, by constantly reminding ourselves that we cannot elevate those material goods to be the number one priority in our lives. So we have to we have to be focused on God as the ultimate provider, not on our skills or abilities.
Sure. When we approach, particularly looking at the life and ministry of Jesus and the subject of competition as it relates to capitalism, what would you say to someone who would try to argue that competition is not Christ-like? Because Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many. God so loved the world that he gave. So there's this idea of sharing, and just this idea of the generosity of God that you see, for example, in the book of Acts, where there was no need among them because they were sharing everything. But it seems like competition is such a high virtue in capitalism that inevitably there's a competition that can result in this sort of dog-eat-dog approach to business. How do you understand competition from a biblical perspective?
That's a great question. I see competition most often in the sense of as iron sharpens iron, man sharpens man. So in a way that makes people and businesses stronger. In an economic sense. So again, I always keep the goal in front of what is the goal of economics. It's thinking about how resources can be transformed into goods and services, right? So if I think about a system that will provide goods and services for those in need, then I understand as an economist that competition will help us do that. Now, in any competition, there are some winners and some losers, even if people in training and in competition both become healthier and stronger as a result of it. Somebody is going to win, somebody is going to lose. And then as Christians, we are called to take care of those who fall behind, take care of those who perhaps are unable to win the competition. Under the stewardship mandate from Genesis, be fertile and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Under that mandate, I think it's crucially important for us to really compare systems and seeing which system allows us to be good stewards of our resources. And, what we currently see in the world is that the poverty, the destitute poverty rates around the globe are falling tremendously. And actually, maybe it's surprising, but I think that competition has a lot to do with this fact. Now only 14% of global population lives in extreme poverty, and that's down from 35% of the global population in 1993, and that's a fall of about 1 billion people. And that, to me, is huge. That is a huge good if I could put it that way. It's simply a good thing that people from different faith backgrounds, from different parts of the world, are now less exposed to destitute poverty than they were before. I think if I could point to a particular part of the system which is responsible for this fall in poverty, I would try to replicate that. And most economists thinking about what has led to this drastic fall of poverty, really a surprising fall of poverty. This drastic fall surprised the United Nations, which set millennium goals that made a lot of news. And, we have beaten the poverty rates that they were projecting. So I think it has to do with globalization and with competition, and in some extent also with urbanization, that why poverty has fallen as drastically as it has. So now we have to take that good, I think, and then we have to see, okay, who has fallen behind? I think as Christians, as a church, we have to say, who is unable to survive this competitive environment? What about people who cannot move to the cities? What about the ones who cannot learn English or whichever language opens the doors for them? What about people who cannot get the education they need in order to operate in this kind of society? So I think that's what we have to do as Christians. So I think from economic perspective, competition is certainly a driving force for good, and it does create losers. And then as a church, we have to think about how do we put people in the best position to succeed, and how to not fall in the materialist trap. Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the only ways to do that, because, I'll hear some of the titans of industries, some very famous management gurus, successful CEOs throughout history, and they're notorious for just how competitive they are and how, they wake up every morning thinking about how they can beat out their competitors and are kind of even braggadocious about it. But I think that really lacks the Christ-like approach, which is not that you try to water down your success or you try to water down your ability or performance, but that you're discipling others in the process, meaning you're not leaving people behind, but because we are on this journey toward becoming who God, as you said earlier, the imago Dei, the image of God, reflecting Jesus, that because this is a journey, we're not leaving other people behind on this journey. And so even though competition, as you said, it does create the winners and the losers in terms of somebody is going to have most of the market share. Somebody is going to have, somebody's going to be in second place in the market, third place, and so on. But that's no reason to not, from what I hear you saying, that's no reason to back down and water down the performance, but to reach out to those who maybe do seem to be being left behind in order to help them make sure their needs are met, not in a kind of a handout sort of a way, because that's not discipling anybody. That's not helping them to become who God has called us to be. So the goal is to go in all the world, not to just make a profit, but to make disciples.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that there's maybe several dimensions here. One is the state response and one is the individual response. I think that thinking from political economy perspective, which is where my doctoral work is, the state response should be, in my opinion, to encourage and promote competition, and because of the kind of positive economic consequences that it has for the least of these, for the people at the bottom of the income distribution, especially, even globally speaking. So I think the state should promote competition because that has positive economic outcomes. But then on the individual perspective, I think that we should exhort our brothers and sisters in Christ to do what Galatians 5:13 recommends. It says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather serve one another humbly in love." So we can be tempted, again, in a capitalist system, which has so much abundance, to indulge the flesh, right? To seek for that, to chase after that next good, to keep up with the Joneses. And yet the Bible exhorts us to serve one another instead, to serve one another humbly and in love.
That's it. And just a few verses later in chapter 6, it says to bear one another's burdens. And I think that's what you're getting at here in terms of the competition is not compete so that you can be number one and just forsake everyone else, but so that you can lead, so that you can set the example, which is really what discipleship is about. It's hard to disciple somebody if you're not in a leadership position in some way.
Yes, and also I think what we see through competition is that the services and goods improve, and that's definitely something that I like to stress with my business students, is that a business will be profitable and successful in a free society when it figures out a way to serve the customer. And a business that does not operate in an atmosphere of competition, which is what was the case in the Soviet system, which I grew up in, simply does not produce the same kind of quality, simply does not know how to meet the needs of the person. And for Christians, this sounds paradoxically, but the business doesn't really know how to serve its consumer very well when it does not. When it doesn't face competition, it's not pushed to do that. Many people, when they travel to the Soviet Soviet part of the world in the early 90s, were so surprised about the lack of the customer service in the stores. They might come into a store wanting to get a loaf of bread, but the attendant would simply sit behind a counter and read a newspaper. And the person would stand in front of them for half a minute. Especially from Texas, people are very nice, so they wouldn't say anything at first. But eventually they would have to ask, and the attendant would look at them angrily. Why are you bothering me? Why are you disturbing my newspaper reading? The customer service idea simply wasn't there. And many companies that came out of the Soviet Union had to go through multiple years of learning to figure out how to compete, which meant how to improve the quality of their goods so that they could be competitive in the global markets. Many companies didn't learn that and went out of business. Some that did became very successful. So I think that one aspect of competition is that it helps us produce better goods, better services. And if we operate in a free society and believe that businesses serve others, then it's a good thing.
It's beautifully said. Well, Jekabs, as we're wrapping it up here, I know that our listeners are wondering where they can get access to more of your thinking along these lines, and on some of the other things that you are passionate about researching and writing on. Where can people learn more about you and what you have going on?
They're welcome to come to LCC website, which is www.lcc.lt, and see a few of the links of me and other faculty that do work here. Also, back when I was living in Texas, me and a few of my colleagues from Dallas Baptist hosted a blog, Terminal Degree Curiosity. That was the name of the blog, so people are free to look that up as well and see some of our dialogues there. And then, we at LCC, we love people from different nations. So if you're ever in the area, you should stop by. We educate people from over 30 countries currently. And, in our small business department, there's people serving from 8 countries on staff. So it's a great international place, and we would love to have, more visitors as well.
Wonderful. Well, lcc.lt is the website there, and also Google Terminal Degree Curiosity, and it sounds like a fascinating blog. Jekabs, is there a parting piece of advice you'd like to leave with our listeners here today to help us, to those of us who are wanting to approach economics from a biblical perspective? What advice would you leave?
I would just encourage those thinking about economic topics to always stay true and sincere as Christians, taking the stewardship mandate very, very seriously for personal lives, also for how we treat the environment and so forth. When I think about what it's like to have a Christian idea of economics, I sometimes think of what it's like to have a Christian idea of dentistry or a Christian idea of chess playing or something like that, and or Christian idea of carpentry. I had a chance to go to Sepphoris, the city, which is not very far from Nazareth in Israel, where many scholars think that Jesus practiced his craft of carpentry before he went into ministry at age 30. And I wonder, what was it like for him to set carpentry standards? What would a good carpenter do? And I can't help but think that a good carpenter would simply try to make sturdy tables, functional chairs, etc. And so then I think about, what is it like? What should a good economist strive for? What should a good political economist strive for? And I think we should strive for the kind of policy that uses our resources wisely, that uses them so as to take care of the least of these, to use New Testament's language. And so that's, I think, the measure of a good economic policy is one that practices good stewardship of resources, and that it provides for needs of those who can least take care of themselves. And so I think that's what we ultimately, as sincere Christians, have to do. And we're going to disagree about some public policy choices. We're going to disagree about how some institutions operate. But as long as we focus on respecting each other, as long as we realize that each person has been created in an image of God, that each person has property over their own lives and their time and their abilities, then I think that we can create and sustain a society that will function well.
Well said. And we'll pray that our legislators get a hold of these principles as well. In fact, you may even want to send this interview over to your congressman or to your legislator there in your area, whoever's making those economic policy decisions. But certainly it really starts at the grassroots. And, going back to the beginning, and just thinking about your church there growing up and how countercultural that was. And really, that's what we're called to be as believers. Jekabs, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise and your heart for the kingdom. And may God continue to bless your work in discipling these students, discipling people to have a more Christ-centered worldview concerning their public life as well as their private life.
Thank you, Darren. It's been my pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, we would greatly appreciate it if you'd leave us a quick rating and review for the Christianity in Business podcast on iTunes. You can get more information about HBU's Center for Christianity in Business at christianityinbusiness.com. Thanks for listening, and keep integrating biblical values into your business.